You'll see the New Jersey Monument on your right. Please remember to drive at 15 miles per hour.
Completed in 1913, this monument honors the New Jersey Brigade that was encamped on this site. It's the only monument in the park that includes a statue of a common soldier. You can see that he is carrying a musket and that he is wrapped in a thin blanket drawn tightly around him. He is perhaps standing on guard duty trying to stay warm, an example of just one of the many hardships endured by the Continental soldiers. General Washington was careful to use military disinformation to exaggerate the strength and defenses of the camp, and it was never attacked by the British. There was no battle here at Valley Forge, but during the 6 months the Army was encamped here, nearly 2,000 people died from illnesses. Malnutrition, the close and unsanitary living conditions, and the damp weather contributed to thousands of troops contracting typhus, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia. Many sick soldiers were moved from Valley Forge to Army hospitals set up in nearby towns such as Yellow Springs, Bethlehem, Reading, and Lancaster. Those who died were buried near the hospital sites where their graves remain today. The practice of medicine was relatively primitive in the 18th century, and supply problems that winter made things much worse. Food, clothing, bedding, medicines, instruments, bandaging, and even wagons for moving supplies and patients were scarce. Finding it difficult to pry supplies from an increasingly tapped-out and angry civilian population, the Continental Congress was forced to appeal to the clergy for donations of food and bandages. And General Washington was outraged to discover that many soldiers who recovered and were ready to return to duty could not, because the clothing they had worn when they entered the hospital had been taken to meet the needs of those soldiers who could stand duty, and no replacement clothing was available. A positive note is that one serious disease of the time, smallpox, scarcely affected the Army at Valley Forge. There had been a serious smallpox epidemic in America, which had killed hundreds of troops earlier in the war. General Washington had initially resisted the relatively new and little understood practice of inoculation, which had been introduced to the New World by African slaves. In fact, he had previously ordered that any officer daring to be inoculated would be cashiered from the Army. The outbreak was extensive and virulent, however, and perhaps it was Martha Washington's calm insistence on receiving an inoculation herself that eventually convinced him to order all soldiers to be inoculated against smallpox. The procedure, in which material from an infected person was scratched into the skin, was risky, but if one survived it, it greatly reduced the chance of death from the disease. Let's return to the time of the encampment. By January 1778, the initial food and supply crisis of December had been dealt with, but not completely solved, by sending numerous foraging parties many miles from the camp, even as far as New Jersey and Delaware, to find, buy, or commandeer desperately needed provisions. But now, in mid-February, a second food and supply crisis develops. Worsening weather has set in and continues throughout the month. The Schuylkill River becomes impassable because of high water, and most of the local roads are flooded. General Washington writes that food and clothing supplies at the camp are
nearly exhausted, and the Army is reduced literally to a starving condition.
Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, serving as an aide-de-camp to Washington, writes that
at this very day there are complaints from the whole line of having been 3 or 4 days without provisions. Desertions have been immense, and strong features of mutiny begin to show themselves. It is indeed to be wondered at that the soldiery have manifested so unparalleled a degree of patience as they have.
At the worst point in early March, almost 3,000 men are listed as unfit for duty due to a lack of clothing.
You will be coming up on the remains of a fort on your right. Please pull over and park when you see the sign marked, "Poor Stop Number 6.